He kept raising his foot for hours, but when Mom approached him he did what we can't think of. The first thing anyone noticed was not the movement itself, but the stillness around it. It was a strange kind of stillness, the kind that doesn't belong in a place meant for life. The morning air inside the sanctuary enclosure carried the warm, slightly sour scent of hay mixed with damp earth, softened by the faint sweetness of overripe fruit left from the night before. A pale gray light filtered through the mesh roofing above, diffused by thin clouds that promised rain but hadn't yet delivered. Usually, mornings here were filled with motion, with the restless shifting of bodies, the soft rustling of straw under heavy paws, the low hum of breath and life unfolding. But not today. Today, there was only him. A young calf, barely a few months old, stood awkwardly near the far edge of the enclosure, his small body trembling beneath skin that still held the softness of youth. His fur caught the dim light in dull patches, not yet thick enough to fully protect him from the chill that lingered in the morning air. And over again, with a motion that seemed both deliberate and confused, he lifted his front foot, held it suspended for a few seconds, and then gently placed it back down. Then again and again. Hours passed, and the pattern did not change. He did not cry. He did not call out. There was no frantic movement, no panic, no instinctual attempt to run or hide, only that repeated motion. Lift, pause, low, as if the act itself held meaning that no one else could yet understand. From a distance, the caretakers watched, their breath visible in the cool air as faint wisps of condensation. The scent of antiseptic from the nearby clinic building drifted faintly into the enclosure, sharp and sterile against the natural smells of soil and straw. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. But it wasn't obvious in the way they were trained to recognize. It was quieter than that. And that silence felt heavier than any scream. Before we go further into this story, take a moment with me. If you're watching this right now, wherever you are in the world, pause for just a second. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if stories like this, stories that reveal something deeper about the silent language between animals and humans, speak to you, consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps these stories reach people who need to hear them. Because what happened next, no one was prepared for. The sanctuary itself lay just beyond the edge of a forest that breathed constantly, even in stillness. The air there was always thick with life, the earthy scent of wet bark, the faint bitterness of crushed leaves underfoot, and the distant, almost metallic tang of rainwater collected in shallow pools. Birds called sporadically from the treetops, their voices echoing through the open spaces like fragments of a larger conversation. He hadn't always been like this. Just days earlier, the calf had been a burst of energy, a small, clumsy body still learning how to belong in its own skin. He would run in short, uneven bursts, kicking up dust that smelled dry and sun-warmed. He would nuzzle into his mother's side, pressing his face into the coarse warmth of her fur, breathing in the familiar scent of safety, milk, soil, and something deeper, something ancient and instinctive. And she had always been there. Her presence was not loud, not overwhelming. It was steady, grounded, the kind of presence that didn't need to assert itself because it simply existed with certainty. Her breathing was slow and rhythmic, a quiet anchor in a world that could sometimes feel too large for something so small. Their bond had been visible in the smallest of ways, in the way he would lean into her without hesitation, in the way she would shift her massive body just enough to shield him from the wind that occasionally swept through the enclosure, carrying with it the cold, damp scent of approaching storms. In the way their breaths would sometimes fall into the same rhythm, rising and falling together like waves that had always known how to meet. So when he began lifting his foot like that, when he stopped running, stopped playing, stopped being what he had always been, the absence of those small, ordinary moments became unbearable. The caretakers tried to intervene. They approached slowly at first, boots pressing into the damp ground with soft, muffled sounds. The smell of rubber and disinfectant clung to their clothing, foreign and sharp against the natural environment. They spoke in low voices, careful not to startle him. But he didn't react. Not with fear, not with curiosity, not even with recognition. He simply continued. Lift, pause, lower. One of the senior veterinarians crouched down at a distance, her eyes narrowing slightly as she observed. There were no obvious injuries, no swelling, no visible cuts. The leg appeared structurally sound. His weight distribution, while hesitant, wasn't entirely abnormal. But something about the repetition, something about the intention behind it, felt wrong. "This isn't random," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. And she was right. As the day wore on, the light shifted from pale gray to a muted gold, the sun breaking weakly through the clouds, and casting long, soft shadows across the enclosure. The air warmed slightly, bringing with it the richer scent of drying earth and sunlit straw. But even as the world around him changed, he did not. By late afternoon, concern had turned into urgency. They tried to guide him gently, using soft barriers and quiet encouragement. But each time they attempted to move him, he resisted, not violently, not with panic, but with a quiet, unyielding refusal. And always that foot, lift, pause, lower. It wasn't until his mother approached that everything changed. She had been watching. From a distance, her large, steady eyes had followed every movement, every failed attempt, every moment of confusion that the humans could not hide despite their efforts to remain calm. The air around her carried a different scent now, something sharper, more alert. Not fear, but awareness, a recognition that something within her world had shifted. As she began to move toward him, the ground seemed to respond to her weight, each step pressing into the soil with a quiet authority. The light caught along the edges of her body, outlining her in a soft glow that contrasted with the gathering shadows of evening. The caretakers instinctively stepped back. They had seen this before, the way a mother responds when something is wrong with her young. It could be protective, it could be unpredictable, but what happened next, none of them had ever witnessed. She didn't rush, she didn't call out. She simply approached him slowly, her breathing deep and controlled, each exhale visible in the cooling air. The scent of her, warm, earthy, familiar, reached him before she did, and for the first time all day, he stopped. The lifted foot remained suspended for a moment longer than usual. Then, instead of lowering it, he turned his head toward her. There was something in that movement, something that felt like recognition breaking through a barrier that had held him captive for hours. She stepped closer, and then, in a gesture so unexpected that it left the caretakers frozen in place, she lowered herself, slowly, carefully, bringing her massive body down to the ground beside him. Her head moved toward his raised leg, and with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible given her size, she nudged it. Once, twice. And then she did something no one could have predicted. She lifted his foot herself and held it, not with force, not with urgency, but with intention. The enclosure fell completely silent. Even the distant sounds of the forest seemed to pause, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The veterinarian's eyes widened as understanding began to form, slow and heavy. "It's not behavioral," she whispered. And in that moment, the truth revealed itself. Hidden beneath the soft pad of his foot, nearly invisible to the eye, was a small embedded shard, thin, dark, and buried just deep enough to cause constant, sharp pain with every step. It had likely lodged itself there hours earlier, perhaps from a broken piece of enclosure material or a stray fragment carried in from outside. Too small to notice at a glance, too painful to ignore. He hadn't been lifting his foot out of confusion. He had been asking for help, but not in the way humans expect. He wasn't crying out. He wasn't limping dramatically. He wasn't collapsing or showing the obvious signs that trigger immediate intervention. He was repeating a message over and over in the only language he knew. And she had understood, without words, without training, without hesitation. The moment the shard was removed, everything changed. The smell of antiseptic returned, sharp and clinical, as the caretakers carefully cleaned the wound. The calf trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden absence of the constant pain that had defined his entire day. And then he stepped. Once, tentatively. Then again, this time without lifting his foot mid-motion. The relief was immediate, visible in the way his body loosened, in the way his breathing shifted from shallow and strained to deep and steady. The tension that had held him rigid for hours seemed to melt away, replaced by something softer, something lighter. But the most powerful moment came not from the healing, but from what followed. He moved toward her, slowly at first, as if rediscovering the act of movement itself. Then, with growing confidence, until he reached her side and pressed himself against her body. And there, in the fading light of evening, with the sky painted in muted tones of gold and gray, something extraordinary happened. Their breathing synchronized. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. Two separate beings, moving as one. The air around them felt different now, warmer, softer. The earlier tension had dissolved into a quiet, almost sacred calm. Even the scent of the enclosure seemed to shift, the sharpness of stress replaced by the grounded, comforting aroma of earth and life continuing as it should. The caretakers watched in silence, aware that they had witnessed something far beyond clinical intervention. Because this wasn't just about a splinter. It was about understanding. It was about a form of communication that exists beneath language, beneath learned behavior, beneath everything we think defines intelligence. It was about the quiet, unshakable certainty of a bond that does not need explanation. There is a tendency in the human world to measure intelligence by complexity, by problem solving, by language, by visible displays of reasoning. But moments like this challenged that definition. Because what she demonstrated, what he relied on, was something else entirely. A kind of knowing, a kind of awareness that doesn't require translation. A sixth sense of connection that operates in silence. And perhaps, in that silence, there is something we have forgotten how to hear. As night settled over the sanctuary, the air cooled once more, carrying with it the damp, mineral scent of approaching rain. The first drops began to fall softly against the enclosure roof, creating a gentle, rhythmic sound that filled the space without disturbing it. They remained together, unmoving, breathing. And in that stillness, there was no longer any mystery. Only understanding, only connection, only the quiet truth that sometimes the most profound acts of love are the ones that happen without a single word. If this story stayed with you, if it made you pause, even for a moment, and think about the unseen ways animals communicate and care for one another, then take a second to support it. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes that animals feel more than we often give them credit for. And I'm genuinely curious, have you ever witnessed something like this? A moment where an animal seemed to understand something that no one else could? Tell me your story in the comments,